Hello, Rocky Ridge students. We are reading Chapter 8 in Lunch Money. I hope you're enjoying this book. All right, here we go. Chapter 8, 2 down. When Greg got to Mr. Z's room after school on Thursday, no one else was there. He sat in a desk in the front row and looked over the clock. It was already 3:05. Greg thought, 6 minutes. If he's not here in 6 minutes, I'm going to soccer. A minute later, Maura busted into the room. Sorry, I'm late, but... Then she saw only Greg was in there. She stopped, then she walked to the front of the room. I thought I was late. You are late, said Greg. He jerked his thumb toward Mr. Z's desk, just not as late as he is. Maura sat down a few seats away and turned to look out the windows. A minute went by. The empty school felt too quiet. Greg said, so what's he want to talk to us anyway? Without turning her head, Maura said, 3 guesses. Then he remembered what Maura had said about his comic book. It was okay, but Greg wanted Maura to finish that sentence. Then he thought, why do you care what she thinks? But after another minute of silence, his curiosity won out. Still, he didn't want Maura to think that he actually cared what she thought. Then he hit on a way to bring up the subject. Greg said, I read your unicorn book. It was good for what it is. Maura turned to face him, arching one pale eyebrow. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing, said Greg. It's not really my kind of story, that's all. You know, princesses and unicorns. I like comic books, and yours book isn't a comic. So why did you read it? Greg shrugged. It was the only reading material I had in the nurse's office. I was bored. How come you read my story? Maura tossed her head. Same reason. That wasn't anything better to do in math. You bought a copy of mine and you said it was good, right? Yeah, Maura admitted, but that's what Greg had been waiting for. But what? What did you like about it? Maura was quiet a moment, and when she spoke, Greg saw she was choosing her words carefully. Well, it's sort of like what you said about my book, about it not being your kind of story. See, I know you want to try to sell a lot of copies. Greg interrupted. Because you think I'm a greedy little money grabber, right? Maura's eyes flashed. Can you just listen? Greg nodded and Maura continued. I like the story. I like the art too. But I don't think many other girls would. And since half of the kids in the school are girls, if you write boy stories, you're only going to sell half as many books as you could. Greg would pretend to look shocked, and then stick a finger at Maura. Boy stories? I'm going to tell you, Miss Sanborn, what you said. Miss Sanborn was their social studies teacher, and she talked a lot about equal rights for women and girls. She got furious whenever someone suggested that a man or woman or boys or girls should be treated differently. Maura said, don't be dumb. I'm not talking about equal rights. I'm talking about what girls like and boys. No matter what Miss Sanborn says. Most boys don't pick stories about princesses, and most girls don't pick stories about cavemen and spears. As Maura finished the sentence, Mr. Z walked in. Cavemen and spears? Are you two calling each other names again? Maura and Greg shook their head. Mr. Z, good. Excuse me, I was late in the office. I was afraid I'd get here and find you two wrestling on the floor or throwing chairs at each other. But you are not name-calling and not fighting. Looks like progress. He pulled a front row desk forward a few feet, turned it around and sat midway between them. Mr. B had been planning on what to say to Greg and Maura all afternoon. He already knew exactly what he wanted this meeting to end up, but he prepared to take this time getting there. In his mind, it was like a math problem. He would add right ideas, subtract wrong ideas, divide fuzzy thinking and pure logic, and then he and children would nod and smile at one another as a peace and understanding of multiplied itself. Looking first into Mora's face and then into Greg's. Mr. Z said, "Now tell me precisely what started this semester in sixth period. Greg, you first." Greg took a deep breath and then let it out slowly. "Well, it really started at the end of lunch period. That's when I found that Mora was selling little books like mine, ripping me off." "I did not rip you off, Mora." Mr. Z raised a warning finger. "Quiet, your turn's coming." Mora nodded but kept on talking. "He said just a minute ago that my story is nothing like his." "Yes," said Greg, his voice raised, "but it's still a mini book, right? Admit it, you ripped me off." "Quiet, both of you," Mr. Z said. Mr. Gray was not used to raising his voice. "I'm not going to put up with this. If you two can't talk it out with me, then I'll turn the whole matter over to Mrs. Danport and your parents." He looked from Mora to Greg and then back again. It was clear. Now I asked Greg to speak first. Mora, not another word. Turning to Greg, he said, "So, you found out Mora had these little booklets for sale, and you got mad. Anything else?" "Well," Greg said, "just that it didn't seem fair. It was my idea, so yeah, I got mad, and I came to the class that way, and you saw the rest. That's all." Mr. Z nodded and said to Greg, "Okay, now it's your turn. Listen." Not a word. Turning to Mora, he said, "Let's hear your side." Mora shrugged. There's not much to tell. I mean, what do I do? I'm sitting here in class and he comes blasting in and starts shouting and throwing stuff in my face. And me hitting him, that was an accident. He said so himself in the nurse's office, so I don't do anything. Greg pushed a puff of air between his lips. Not a word, but close to draw a glare from the math teacher. Mr. Z turned back to Mora. "Show me your little book. Do you have one?" Mora zipped open a pocket in the front of her backpack and pulled out a copy of The Lost Unicorn and handed it to Mr. Z. He quickly turned the pages, scanning the text, looking at the pictures. Then turning to Greg, he said, "And about yours?" Greg took a copy from his pencil case and handed it over. Mr. Z did a skim. Looking up from Creon's face to Greg's face, he said, "So even though these are clearly very different items, you're still mad that Mora did something similar, right? Used the same idea?" Greg nodded. "My idea. Right, my idea." Greg, looking at Greg's eyes, Mr. Z said, "So you agree with me that the little book with pictures is an idea?" "Yeah, if Greg, of course." "Yes," said Greg, "of course. Like I said, it was my idea." Mr. Z shook his head. "That's not what I said. I said the little book with pictures isn't an idea, and it's not your idea." Then holding up both mini books between his thumbs and index fingers, he said, "Right. These two different things are still just one idea, right?" Greg nodded. "Right. And the idea was mine first." Mr. Z leaned forward. "But the thing about a true idea is that no one can really own it, even the person who used it first. In the mathematics of the Smyrns were the first to use the place value over 5,000 years ago. But they don't own that idea. And when you sit here in my room adding large numbers and carrying tens or hundreds over to the next place column, does a Sumerian come over into the room and say, Hey, quit it. That's my idea." Greg didn't answer. He lowered his eyes and stared at the smear of green gum on the floor. Mr. Z went on, "Now, if Mora had used your character, this Creon guy, or if she had made her drawings look like yours, then I'd think you'd have more reason to be upset. But she didn't do that. She used her old idea, a small book, in her own way, and yes, she might have seen you do it first, but that's how ideas work. They spread. So I don't think you should be mad at Mora. If anything, you should feel flattered. Someone thought the way you used an old ideas was new and interesting. That's what she wanted to try out for herself." Mr. Mr. Z paused. Greg looked down at his feet, studying his sneakers. He decided to just let Mr. Fizzyhead talk himself out. Why argue? The sooner this guy finished yakking, the sooner he could leave for soccer practice. Look at me, Greg. Greg tipped his head back, flicked his eyes at the teacher's face, and then back to the floor. The math teacher said, "Is any of this making sense to you?" Greg shrugged. "Sure, I guess so." "Then I think all this adds up to one thing." Mr. Z paused for Greg, looking at him in the face. It didn't happen, so he said, "Greg, you need to apologize to Mora." Greg's head jerked up. "Apologize? Me? No way." Mora knew how stubborn Greg was, and she liked the talking they had been having before the teacher had arrived. She quickly said, "It's okay, Mr. Z. He doesn't have to apologize." Mr. Z said, "Yes, he does. First, he has to apologize to you, and then he has to apologize for me for making a huge disturbance in my room and wasting precious time. And all because of a comic book." Greg felt a fury rise in his chest. He wanted to tip his head back and howl like a crayon. He wanted to get up close to this man's huge nose and shout, "I'm the guy with the black eye here. I'm the one who's had his idea ripped off. Apologize? This is so stupid. No, actually, you're stupid." Greg felt his face getting red, felt his heart pounding, and then, for the second time in one day, Greg felt his nose began to bleed. Only this time, it was a real gusher. Blood streamed out of his left nostril, over his lips, dripping off his chin, splattering his shirt and the desk. Mr. Z put one hand over his mouth, with the other pointing the shaky finger to his eyes. "Oh, what? Oh, no, your nose, it's..." But he couldn't say the B word. Mr. Z's face went pale as paper. Sweat stood out on his forehead and behind his hands, still covering his mouth. His breath came in gasps. Earlier, Greg had noticed that Mr. Z's reaction to blood. This time he couldn't miss it, and he decided to enjoy it. Greg leaned and nodded at Mr. Z, making no effort to stop the flow. "Yes, my nose is bleeding, very bloody. It's bleeding and blood is getting all over the place. Blood, bloody, bloody, bloody blood." Mr. Z turned away, almost throwing up. "Greg, Mora," snapped, "stop it. That's mean." She's already grabbed tissues from the teacher's desk. "Here." And then she pushed the box into Greg's hands. Turning to Mr. Z, she said, "I can get you something. Some water?" Mr. Z shook his head. "I just need to lie down." And then with Mora to steady him, he eased out of the desk and into the floor, flat on his back, eyes closed. "Not you," Mora said to Greg. "Sit on the floor and lean forward. And squeeze your nose hard." Greg followed the order, but then he decided he'd be more comfortable lying down. Mora said, "I'll get the nurse and a cold pack. 2 cold packs." And she left Greg and Mr. Z littered the floor in room 27. Happy Thursday.